fingerprints, but I stressed in the camera so that we're not too concerned with the size, with the exception when you go to blow them up for court purposes, why then they will be drawn, as to say, the inked impression will be the same size that of the latent print.
Good. Which brings us to another fingerprint question for Professor Roth. How long do fingerprints last?
That's always a good question, and it's always asked.
You have a good answer?
Of course, yes, I do. It's a variable. It's unpredictable, and we're not particularly concerned with the duration of them. We cover them. Then the circumstances, in many instances, will prove or disprove the time that is concerned with the duration of the fingerprint.
I think the motivation in the question here is that, for example, if a crime is not immediately discovered, would evidence such as fingerprints, latent prints, would they evaporate after a while or dissolve or dissipate?
I think what you have to clarify is that this question is often asked with some particular value in mind, trying to use the duration of time as part of your case. And as a technician, you are certainly recovering the evidence. This is your prime concern. Now, as to whether a print that developed, that just came up, can be pronounced a recent print is beside the point.
It's not material to
It's not material at the time, and if someone were to make a pronouncement, he could be proven so pathetically wrong, it could jeopardize the value of the case.
One other very interesting point in your lecture was the fact that fingerprints could be taken from skin. And I was just wondering what contrast medium was used in that particular case.
Well, recognize that a lot of fingerprints appear because there's a foreign matter that has been deposited on the surface, and in many instances we are cognizant of the processing that takes place, but in this particular case, this was a powdered fingerprint, and I'm not trying to overemphasize the unusual. I'm just trying to point out that we shouldn't exclude possibilities because we think they're a little bit fantastic.
Well, I think that the majority of police officers who are watching this program, except those who have had professional training in that regard, would be the least place they'd be inclined to look for prints.
Well, I would like to think that every police officer would have looked in the back of that drawer, and the inside of the drawer. But, you know, it is pretty frustrating to come upon a scene where a lot of people have been, possibly, a lot of activity, a lot of possible touching, and then to say, where shall the technician use his judgment? In many cases, what we're arguing against is that the initial officer on the scene thinks there's something that can be touched because it's an unlikely place to find evidence. So we're saying any place is likely, any place is possible.
Great. For the panel, how much of the various special, for example, moldage, hair and fibers, fingerprints, ballistics, should the investigator know? Now, this is a rather broad question here, and of course we have a broad and talented panel. I don't think that you can set any limits on how much he should know.
We'll never set limits on how much someone should know. Positively, the more the...
Horizons are unlimited here. It depends very much because the techniques themselves are changing, as in fingerprint identification and scanning now, the scanning techniques.
But
there is always something...
make a comment on that?
Surely.
I'm a firm believer that unless you are a trained technician, you should not attempt in any way to move or disrupt that piece of evidence. I've seen this happen time and time again, where a smattering of knowledge in a field that requires a lot of knowledge can be a very dangerous thing. I prefer to leave it to the experts, to the technicians to handle.
Well, I think in fairness to the questioner here, Professor, it mentions how much should the investigator know. An investigator could include a technician or the first officer on the scene. In many departments, I imagine it's a while before an expert can arrive on the scene. So if he knows a little something about the subject, he is probably then aware of the dangers of moving or removing what might possibly be evidence.
Well, I think Captain Sullivan would bear us out on this. How much knowledge he should have is the question, and there's no limit to that. How much he should apply that knowledge is where the area of danger exists.
Professor Swidler's remark.
So therefore, I think that what George has mentioned is very true, that if the individual tries to go beyond his own capability or responsibility, he becomes part of the problem.
He might ruin an otherwise good case.
I was thinking, Jim, of that case that you mentioned with the pistol in the pocket.
Right. There's all types of degrees to this, of course, and I believe firmly that a police officer who aspires to excel in his profession should get the advantage of as much knowledge as he can. but to take the professor's warning, he shouldn't go beyond that particular knowledge. The thing is that if you recognize your limitations and you take action to freeze the scene, to preserve that scene for the expert, or to make sure that all the evidence that is present at that particular scene is not disturbed, I think that in many instances policemen overreact at the scene of a crime, particularly a sensational crime, by rushing there, and that if somebody doesn't take control and exclude everybody, including well-meaning policemen, that the scene might not be intact when the expert gets there to do whatever
Very good point.
his specialty is.
Very good point.
Someone has EP on the panel here, Professor Dupion, talking about the pistol case.
We had the same question, I think. What do you think, Lou?
Well, I don't know. I firmly believe that, so that it isn't anything that there's any mystery about it, it should be left there. All evidence should be left there at the scene, and especially in a major case. On a minor case, perhaps a police officer being present might want to look over the evidence. But I firmly believe that any major case, as Captain Sullivan pointed out, I think is most important to point out to keep away the flock of well-meaning people, whether they be police officers or even passerbys that might come into the picture. They add, as we said, they destroy evidence, they add additional things that aren't supposed to be there. I definitely would let the scene be just as it is for the technician so that he knows where he stands when he arrives.
I sort of imagine, though, the post office would frown on a loaded gun being sent with the mail if you were sending it down to the bureau, saying in Washington.
No.
Well, as a matter of fact, I had occasion not too long ago to send quite a few weapons down to a laboratory in the South, and we were not allowed to send it through the mail. I had to send it through Railway Express after it was properly boxed. The mail would not take it.
Jim, I would like to draw the distinction between what's done right at the crime scene and then the fact that time is always our enemy. But there's so much that can be done with consultation, with good sense, with the best know-how of everyone available, instead of thinking we must do everything now even though it's wrong. As far as that gun goes, we've discussed the preservation of the position of the shells, actually making sure that when it is unloaded, you know what condition you changed.
But I think the person's concern, Professor Roth, is not the gun going, but the gun going off.
Right, all right, but the gun does not go off itself, and if it's left alone until you are sure what you're doing, it's only in the handling where incidents have happened that have been regrettable. I think while it is there, we're in good shape as long as that scene is preserved undisturbed.
Jim, I just happened to think of a good point as Bob was talking. On this revolver, I've seen it happen where another officer will come by and pick up the weapon and open it. Now, what has happened here? You've had the 2 shots fired, and then he'll get 2 shells, empty shells in there, and probably 2 live ones, and he closes the revolver. And who's to say later on what the position of that open
That becomes very
It
important.
becomes very important as to the position of that. So that's why I said earlier that leave it alone and let someone that's qualified to handle it, especially a murder weapon. Why, so much can be gained from just the mere presence of it, how it was located, and exactly where it was. Of course, this will all show up in the photographs, and if anything has been moved, why, this is a cardinal sin.
Well, that question you raised about the suicide with the knife on the shelf, I think the New Yorker would call that the neatest trick of the week. Incidentally, we are fortunate to have in our audience again Captain Hogan from the Boston Police Department, who's been an old friend of the program and a former panelist. And I understand that some of his colleagues are over in Station 4, glued to the set. So, 61 of them. Good. So if they can get to a phone now, they'll have the honor of asking you a question. They've been trying to trip you up for years, Bill. They can't do it. The question is ultraviolet light and infrared light useful on the crime scene, and what can it show?
Who's going to take it?
Well, let's not hesitate. Ultraviolet light is a portable piece of apparatus that can be used. It can show up fluorescence. It can be a field check.
Laundry marks, things.
Laundry
Yes,
marks.
it can do a lot of things at the crime scene. The black light, the same way, can be used for a field check, but stress again that it is a field check to try and eliminate things that can be processed in other directions. And not, let's figure, that we're doing all the work at the crime scene. Back at the laboratory, you can do so much more to examine these things leisurely and correctly. So while it is possible, yes, let's not, again, overemphasize some of these field techniques.
Incidentally, when Steve told me we were going to have an interesting cast for this program, I didn't realize that he was talking about the one that you were going to bring.
Oh, the
Molage.
the molage.
Now, I have a question from our television audience. Can the panel give us some guidelines about conducting an exterior crime scene search over a large area? Here we're back to that Professor LeDrew bit.
Well, let's go back to actual experience. A case where a body is found, in this case, a female body, evidently throttled to death, and in the field. This occurred in a foreign country. The officers at the scene did an excellent job when a call was received that a body was out in a certain area. The nearest building was several hundred yards away. The field itself was strewn with rubbish and old doors that had been a bombed-out section, and the body was almost in the exact center with an area around it devoid of anything except this rubbish for several hundreds of yards. And there had to be an entrance in there, and there had to be an exit. These officers realized this. After all, the body just wasn't thrown there, and they immediately placed a man on each side of this square, fortunately, put signs up in the particular language that no unauthorized person, hastily scribbled it, was to enter and stay there. They did not attempt to go upon the scene whatsoever. When the investigators did come there, and the medical examiner, no one was allowed in there who did not produce credentials or had authority or a reason for being there. And what amazed me most of all was after the initial investigation had been completed, and it took some number of hours, the medical examiner in this particular case, and I have pictures of this, actually went ahead and made an autopsy on the bottom, on the body, on top of a door that was not far from the scene. And I have some pictures of this, and it's a very unusual thing. But getting back to security, when you have great distances, when there's a possibility or traces of a path leading in to where the body is, this should be very carefully preserved in all respects. If it is raining on the outside or snowing, try and cover up the body in the immediate vicinity if you can to protect it from the elements. But generally speaking, you need or will not have that great an area to protect immediately. If you're looking, however, for a weapon later on, you may require the services of any number, scores of people, in a very systematic search. But before that, you will have carefully covered the immediate area where the body was found. Have anything to add on that, Lou?
Yes, Judge. Well, I don't think that was the answer that they're looking for. They're asking about the actual conducting of the search itself. And it depends on the number of men you have to work with. But any given area of search, if you can get enough men together, say maybe 10, it'd be a goodly number, and extend them so at arm length, and have them take and grid it, and make a sweep. First you take and make a sweep forward, and then, in other words, horizontally and then vertically. And then you've got that whole area completely covered. We've done this. We've done this many times, not only in the actual crime scene itself, but we've run this at the police academy, where we have the students make an outside search. And this way, we plant, say, maybe 15 or 20 objects, and you'd be surprised.
Like an Easter egg hunt.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. The first time around, why, they come up with a handful. Second time around, they'll come up with a few more. And when they're all through, much to their surprise, you pull out another half dozen or so. Why, it's surprising that unless it's conducted in that way, systematic grid search, both horizontally and vertically, with arm extended so that each area is particularly covered, why, then you'll get a good search.
You're sort of squaring the circle. In the inside, you're talking about clockwise and counterclockwise. Incidentally,
Same
a
idea.
question was raised before. Does it make any difference which way you start, clockwise or counterclockwise?
I don't think it makes any particular difference. For instance, I'm right-handed. I would normally start to the right.
Right. Oh.
Suppose you're left-handed. You would normally start to the left. As
Wonder if
long
it-
as you cover it both ways.
Coriolis has anything to do with that. Most people don't realize in the northern hemisphere, the water goes down the drain clockwise. In the southern hemisphere, it goes down counterclockwise. Whether that would have any relation to the search.
Well, Jim, before this goes down the drain, why are we always talking about only one search? In many cases, when you've made one search and you have found something, you are more knowledgeable as to what you might be looking for. So while we make one systematic search and hope it's done right, let's realize if this is undisturbed, we have more passes. We're not trying to beat the clock as far as crime solutions go.
Well, you brought that out a number of times, Professor, and I think it's very interesting to reiterate that time is not necessarily, it's your enemy, yes, in the respect that clues can be disturbed or destroyed, but it's not your enemy when it comes to a search for them.
I think it's been our enemy in the past because we seem to be stressing working against pressure. And there are two levels of operation in police work. There is what must be done immediately, and then given the time and the backing up and the manpower and some of these other things, let's assume that we then make time work for us.
I can add a little bit to that, and that is that if you make a search, make it thorough, regardless of the time, simply because this may be the last time that you will be able to get on these premises without a search warrant. And that should you go back at a future date and look for evidence without the protection afforded you by a warrant, and looking for vital evidence and vital pieces of information, and violate the provisions and the protection guaranteed under the Fourth Amendment, that a vital part of your case may be lost. And this happened to us in Worcester, in an effect of a shotgun shooting where one particular shotgun shell was missing. And it wasn't discovered that it was missing until sometime later in the investigation, at which time the officers went back and under the assumption they were still working under the previous arrangement and that they had not totally vacated the premises as a result of completing the search, they picked up the expended shell, the expended cartridge. And the admissibility of this particular thing was argued very strenuously in court. There was motions to suppress on it, and I believe they successfully suppressed them. So to go along with Professor Roth's thinking that we must be most thorough when we're on the premises that first time, and to identify and collect and preserve every piece of evidence that we intend to use in evidence at a later date.
Because that's a very interesting legal point that you bring up, the need for a warrant where you have, say, a capital crime committed. And the fact that you have to go to court to get a warrant to search those premises is a very interesting legal point.
Usually you're there at the request of somebody who's in legal control of the premises at that time, when you're in your initial stages of your investigation.
And who may have a vested interest in the, apprehension of the suspect.
But at a later date or a later time when everything is calmed down to a degree and there are axes to grind, so to speak, you may not be welcome back the second time, and you might have to go back by virtue of a warrant to secure evidence that you could have gotten the first time around.
But then wouldn't the warrant have to be specific and have to deal with particularity as far as the object and its location?
Right.
Which gives you another headache.
It does, it certainly does.
Is the trend towards specialization that Professor Swidler talked about in the last two programs going to go on? And if so, will it include the patrolmen more and more? This sort of leads into that other question we had.
Yes, we discussed that in the last program we had. The trend toward specialization, as far as the patrolman is concerned, is only limited by the individual patrolman. I don't know of a police department, no matter how small, well, let's say at least 4 or 5 men, the minimum, whose chief would not be very definitely interested if any of his men profess a deep interest in the field of photography or fingerprints or ballistics, and who would not go out of his way, without, of course, having to obstruct the normal workload, to help that man to get that specialization. As I mentioned before, not every police officer wants to go to college. Not every police officer wants to get a degree. Many of them want to specialize and should specialize. There just aren't enough in the field of specialization, in my opinion, throughout our country. I think it's a wonderful opportunity today with the government, of course, making funds available for him to get this specialization from accredited schools and universities. So I say there is no limit except that which the individual patrolman places upon himself.
Time has never been better. There's a question that comes in here that's a little aside from the issue. Are dogs useful in searching a crime scene, for example, for narcotics?
I can remember.
Now, you know, it's interesting this question comes in because last weekend I was down in Miami and I watched a demonstration with canine dogs where one was trained for this purpose, and he could sniff it. The other dogs couldn't.
Jim, we had the K9 Corps on the Cape, and we had a man trained to handle this dog, and as far as we had made a search of a hotel, which was pretty large one at that, and had some 40, 50 rooms. That dog took that handle through those rooms, and it seemed to me in about 10 minutes flat, and he had that place searched very thoroughly. If that person had been in there, he'd have smelled them out. So that as far as search for an individual is concerned,
they're good.
Excellent, excellent. But as far as narcotics, this is something I passed to someone else.
Well, in the area of narcotics, I think what would have to be proven is the same thing that has to be proven to qualify a police officer or some technician as an expert, that it would have to be proven to the satisfaction of the court.
Can you see the dog taking the stand?
Well, it would have to be proven, yeah, actually in field tests to the satisfaction of somebody in the judiciary that this dog could in fact do what he was advertised to do.
Although I think in this particular instance, he would probably be used more than anything else to lead the individual to the stash or to the pad, whatever it happened to be, rather than for his future use in court. He would be the on point, so to speak.
Well, they become a question then of your search and seizure. You're using him as an instrument of a search.
Because if the defense attorney asked the question, how did you know, and he said, the dog told me, well, he'd be in trouble, I'm sure.
It is a fine technical point there.
Yeah. Question, what is the best way of packaging and transporting narcotics? I know that there is some danger from handling powerful chemicals like LSD. Should any special precautions be taken? Would anyone on the panel care to...
It all depends on what the particular narcotic
Well,
was.
he refers here, for example, like LSD.
LSD,
which is
no
colorless,
problem.
odorless.
No problem in transporting that.
Yeah.
Usually the officer who has obtained the narcotic will usually take it in person so that he'll keep the chain of continuity there, but it can be transmitted by mail, no problem.
As far as the packaging is concerned, the same thing would apply that applied to your moolage. He would have to seal it and identify it, initial it.
I would definitely say that it should go registered mail, however, and make sure that that's covered.
We'd have an awful happy mailman otherwise. Can I ask about this one, talking about mail? These questions come in a very strange sequence here. Can I ask the post office to check on the source or destination of mail from a specific address, or do I need a court order? I think what they're referring to here are mail covers. And my recollection, you gentlemen can concur or not, my recollection has been that this has been a request, an interagency request to the post office department, and it's discretionary with them as to whether or not they will execute it. I know there have been recent congressional hearings on this subject relating to the right to privacy that have somewhat dampened the ardor of some agencies to request it. So I imagine it would have to be a serious enough situation to make that request to the post office.
Perhaps it's just as well to comment that it wasn't abused or overused. It was always for a very limited time, that it was
and really nobody
was
knew
not
it
opening
except you
anything.
and the postal
Right.
inspector.
And since it wasn't really the fishing expedition that so many have made it out to be, that you were looking for something specific that was part of your case, in many instances it was a valuable adjunct to investigation and not mishandled at all.
In the minute or so that we have left, I wonder if maybe Mr. Cataldo or Captain Sullivan would comment on the use of the National Crime Information Center in Washington and checking on stolen property. The question has come in on that.
You want to take it, George?
Well, it's a wonderful thing if you've got the ability, if you've got the wherewithal to communicate with it. I know that the city of Boston has, and that Worcester is currently in the process now of obtaining a teletypewriter to feed into the Boston system with which we can communicate, and it's a wonderful aid to law enforcement. The question comes on cost of the original equipment.
I might add to what Captain Sullivan said. I think that in short time you're going to see where this is going to spread. Now, Washington has its lines out to the key cities of the United States with information that it's only as good as the information that's fed into it.
That's right.
So that in time you're going to see a great deal more on this.
I think that we can say in conclusion the fact that an officer on the crime scene will eventually submit this evidence to a laboratory for examination doesn't relieve him of the responsibility to become an expert in the recognition and collection of physical evidence. And the program has demonstrated the need for closer cooperation between the field man and the lab man. And equally important, I think, are the ways in which he reduces what he sees and what he collects to writing. The subject of our next program will be report writing. And I hope that you'll all be watching that as well. Thank you, panel, for coming here today and for engaging in this very interesting discussion.